The heavy metal skillet sat directly over the bright blue flame of the kitchen stove, throwing off a rich, buttery heat that gradually pushed back the crisp autumn chill of the early morning. Dan adjusted his grip on the smooth wooden handle, his weathered face tightening into a sudden grimace as a sharp flash of pain shot straight through his right shoulder, a stubborn reminder that his chronic bursitis was acting up once again. He slowly poured a large ladle of golden batter into the sizzling pan, watching it expand at the edges with a soft hiss. The delicious fragrance of cooking vanilla, melted butter, and toasted grain began to drift across the worn linoleum floor, creeping slowly into the narrow hallway where the rest of the family was just beginning to stir from their sleep. The screen door creaked open with a slow, familiar whine, and Jackie stepped into the room, lifting her chin to sniff the air in complete and utter amazement. She stopped in her tracks, looked around the kitchen, and remarked with a broad smile that for once she had walked into the house and found that something smelled genuinely good. Dan let out a low, dry chuckle, continuing to work the skillet with a careful, measured rhythm. He explained with genuine pride that today was a monumental milestone because it was officially Beverly Rose's very first day of kindergarten. He wanted to ensure the sweet little girl felt entirely special before facing the outside world, so he had decided to prepare her absolute favorite breakfast of sweet Captain Crunch pancakes, planning to pile them high with fluffy whipped cream and bright red strawberries. Becky walked into the kitchen right behind her sister, leaning her shoulder casually against the worn wooden counter and laughing softly at the decadent culinary display. She teased him with a smirk, stating that it was a truly magnificent strategy to get a 5-year-old child completely jacked up on pure sugar first thing in the morning, only to hand her off to an unsuspecting schoolteacher a mere hour later. She began opening the various freezer compartments, searching through the accumulated frost for the necessary ingredients. When her hands found nothing but empty space where the fruit should be, she turned around with an annoyed expression, demanding to know where the pack of frozen strawberries had gone. Dan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking slightly guilty as he gingerly rubbed his aching shoulder joint. He confessed rather sheepishly that he had been using the frozen strawberry pack as a makeshift cold compress in bed to soothe his incredibly sore muscles. Becky rolled her eyes, closing the freezer door with a soft thud. She pointed out that if he desperately needed a cold pack for his physical ailments, he should have used the bag of frozen broccoli instead, noting that soothing an injury was the absolute only reason they ever bought broccoli in the first place, since nobody in the house actually intended to eat it. Dan wrinkled his nose in complete disgust, muttering that he simply did not like having green broccoli anywhere near his mouth, even if it was trapped inside a sealed plastic bag, though he conceded her point made logical sense. Darlene entered the room next, her heavy boots clacking softly on the floor as she held a small, flat package wrapped in faded brown paper. She announced to the gathered family that the big day had finally arrived, and that she had brought a little present for Beverly Rose to celebrate her major step into the educational system. Becky leaned over her shoulder, gasping dramatically when she realized what lay beneath the wrapping paper. She asked in utter disbelief if Darlene was seriously giving a kindergarten student an old, scratched plastic pencil case. Darlene nodded proudly, entirely defending her choice. She explained that it was her very own vintage pencil case from her own childhood school days. She pointed toward the faded lettering on the side, which clearly displayed the cynical motto to trust no one, viewing it as a highly practical foundation for a child entering the public school system. Becky snorted into her coffee cup, moving past her sister to pour a fresh drink. As she did, a powerful wave of floral perfume followed her every movement. Darlene sniffed the air sharply, coughing slightly into her hand. She asked Becky if she was actively looking to hit on the new kindergarten teacher because the overwhelming scent of her cheap car wash perfume practically announced to the world that someone should buy her a sandwich in exchange for her absolute devotion. Becky lifted her chin defensively, smoothing down her outfit. She replied that she merely wanted to make an exceptional first impression on the gentleman, adding with a sharp grin that if the teacher happened to be independently wealthy, entirely single, and only took the teaching job to ease his immense social guilt about his family money, that would simply be an added bonus for her. Darlene smirked, taking a seat at the table. She pointed out that Becky was clearly attempting to suck up to authority, questioning what kind of message that sent to her young daughter. Becky countered immediately, asserting that there was absolutely nothing wrong with trying to be the teacher's pet. In her view of the world, a person had to actively work the system from the inside if they ever wanted to achieve real success. Darlene laughed, asking if that specific philosophy was the reason Becky always dressed exactly like her own middle school teachers when she was a little kid. Becky turned around sharply, her face flushing. She stated that first of all, she looked absolutely fantastic in knit separates during those years. Furthermore, she argued that her calculated strategy had worked perfectly, explaining that her old teacher had grown to love her so intensely that Becky had practically doubled her personal wardrobe by inheriting old clothes after the poor teacher's husband left her. A tragic event that caused the lonely woman to turn to sweet pie as her sole source of comfort. Before the argument could escalate any further, Jackie looked toward the dark hallway, wondering aloud when Beverly Rose would finally come upstairs to the kitchen. She explained that she was there with her camera fully charged, ready to document every single moment of the big day for good memories. Darlene softened slightly, admitting the gesture was sweet of her. Jackie nodded, a faraway look entering her eyes. She explained that she wanted the little girl to have the beautiful, supportive memories that she herself had been completely denied. She recalled how her own mother had bluntly told her that she was far too plain-looking to ever be liked naturally by her peers, instructing her to wear a short skirt, climb directly to the absolute top of the school jungle gym, and ensure that she would at least be popular with the boys standing at the bottom looking up. The kitchen fell into a stunned silence for a brief second. Becky blinked, remarking that it sounded like an incredibly dysfunctional childhood memory. Jackie continued without missing a beat, adding that when the jungle gym strategy failed to yield results, her mother made sure to provide her with a thick wad of dollar bills so she could pass the money out to the boys just to bribe them into talking to her at recess. Darlene analyzed the scenario with her usual dry tone, remarking that it sounded like the exact psychological opposite of being a stripper, given that Jackie was showing her underwear and paying the audience instead of taking their money. Jackie snapped her fingers, pointing at Darlene in total agreement, confirming that her sister had summarized the tragedy perfectly. Meanwhile, Becky was busy hovering over a small plastic lunchbox on the counter. She announced that she was placing a heartfelt, handwritten note inside Beverly Rose's lunch alongside a sandwich cut into the shape of a heart. She asked the room if her message was perhaps too much, reading aloud that when Beverly Rose ate the sandwich, her mother's heart would be inside her tummy all day long. Darlene made a gagging sound at the sentimentality, but Becky ignored her, turning back to her daughter. Becky explained that she knew this morning would be an emotional experience for everyone, which was why she had entirely cleared her work schedule to ride along to the school for support. Darlene narrowed her eyes, accusing Becky of trying to co-opt her special parenting moment, firmly stating that she was entirely prepared for the day. Suddenly, Beverly Rose bounded into the room, wearing a bright new backpack that looked slightly too large for her small frame. Darlene looked at her daughter, and a wave of sudden maternal panic washed over her face as the reality of the separation hit her. She gasped that she would not see her again until noon, admitting that she knew this emotional breakdown would happen. Turning to Becky with a desperate shift in attitude, Darlene asked if the offer to ride along was still open. Becky smiled triumphantly, making a cheerful, repetitive noise as she grabbed her keys, happy to be needed. Back at the kitchen table, Harris walked in, watching Dan struggle to lift the heavy iron skillet with his right hand. She sighed, pointing out that large corporations sold pre-made ketchup in actual stores, meaning he did not have to slave away making his own condiments from scratch. Dan glared up at his granddaughter, his knuckles white around the handle of the skillet. He warned her not to make fun of a grown man holding a heavy piece of cast-iron cookware, muttering that he was almost old enough to commit a serious crime and old enough not to care about serving the prison time for it. Harris shrugged, noting that he would have to attack her with his left hand, which she highly doubted he could manage given his current physical limitations, noting that his bursitis was clearly winning the battle. Dan stubborned his jaw, insisting that he would be perfectly fine. Harris smirked, stating that a regular, unmoving tomato had just clearly beaten him in a physical fight, which was a sad state of affairs for an old man. Jackie raised her hands, stepping forward with an enthusiastic smile. She announced that she might be able to help him with his chronic shoulder pain, claiming that she had recently undergone extensive training in the ancient art of Reiki, and several people in her spiritual circle had mentioned that she possessed genuine healing powers. Dan looked at her suspiciously, shifting back in his chair and stating that she was absolutely not allowed to touch him. Jackie reassured him, waving her hands in gentle, circular motions through the air. She explained that her hands would merely hover over the specific area where it hurt, using her natural internal energy to identify and remove the spiritual blockage so that healing could take place naturally without any physical contact. Dan hesitated, then leaned back, reiterating that there must be absolutely no touching involved. Jackie nodded solemnly, instructing him to close his eyes, clear his mind, and try his absolute best to relax. Once Dan complied, letting out a heavy breath, Jackie began to move her hands rapidly above his shoulder, generating a bizarre, trembling motion while making a loud, rhythmic vibrating sound with her mouth. Dan opened one eye, watching her performance, and immediately broke into a fit of laughter, telling her that her strange display was doing absolutely nothing for his physical ailment. Jackie stopped, frowning at his lack of faith, urging him to allow the energy in. She called him by his name, Dan, warning that his deep-seated cynicism was the ultimate barrier to true health and longevity, deciding that she would simply have to extend the frequency of her spiritual energy and dig a little bit deeper into his aura. Dan looked at her warily, asking one final time to ensure she would not touch him, and Jackie called him a big baby, reaffirming that she had no intention of making physical contact. At that exact moment, Harris walked back into the center of the room, stopping dead in her tracks to stare at the older adults, asking what on earth the two freaks were doing in the middle of the kitchen. Jackie dropped her hands, explaining that her grandfather was suffering from severe, debilitating bursitis in his shoulder, and she was simply attempting to heal him using alternative medicine. Harris sighed, shaking her head at the older generation, stating that she could not comprehend why baby boomers insisted on waving their hands around in the air like lunatics when they could easily just smoke some medicinal cannabis to solve their physical problems. She confessed that she personally smoked it every single morning to loosen up her muscles before she exercised, though she casually admitted that she usually ended up skipping the actual exercise entirely, choosing instead to spend hours watching videos on social media of people accidentally falling down. But she still felt absolutely fantastic regardless. Jackie objected instantly, declaring that Dan did not need any more drugs introduced into his system, arguing that his old, fragile veins could barely transport his regular blood as it was. Dan slammed his hand on the table, telling them to knock it off with the constant old guy jokes. He admitted that he used to smoke a bit of weed back in his high school days whenever he hurt himself playing football, but he had completely forgotten about it over the years. Harris leaned against the counter, pointing out that his high school days were ancient history. She noted that nowadays, he drank like a fish, ate terrible, greasy food, and really did not need to throw any more toxic trash onto the absolute environmental landfill that he called a body. She explained that the modern cannabis industry was entirely different from the illegal grass of his youth, telling him that he could walk right into a legal dispensary and purchase carefully cultivated, high-quality strains that could genuinely target his specific shoulder pain. She boldly suggested that they all take a trip to the local weed store immediately. Dan considered the option for a moment, his shoulder throbbing painfully, and finally nodded, agreeing to go to the store. Harris smiled, announcing that she would absolutely be going with them to act as a street guide who could speak the lingo. Dan smiled dryly, remarking that a street guide would be nice, but he was fairly certain Snoop Dogg was currently too busy baking gourmet cupcakes with Martha Stewart to assist them. Harris clarified that she was talking about herself, looking at her grandfather and joking that he had not even taken a single tokay of the jazz cabbage yet, and he was already completely unable to follow a simple, straightforward conversation. Meanwhile, at the local elementary school, the bright classroom was filled with small tables and colorful posters. The kindergarten teacher stood at the front of the room, holding up a large, blue cardboard cutout. She spoke in a bright, exaggerated tone, asking her class of littles if anyone knew what specific geometric shape she was holding. Beverly Rose raised her hand high into the air, shouting out that it was a triangle before anyone else could even blink. The teacher smiled patiently, thanking Beverly Rose for the answer, and then held up a second cardboard cutout, asking the room to identify the next shape. Before the other children could even process the question, Beverly Rose loudly announced that it was a rectangle. Becky sat in a small adult chair at the back of the room, beaming with intense pride. She whispered loudly to the parent sitting next to her, bragging that her daughter was a chip off the old block. She joked that nobody should let the permanent spaghetti stains on the girl's shirt fool them, because Becky herself had been in the Honor Society for 3 years running during her own school days. Darlene, sitting right beside Becky, muttered under her breath that Becky was also a massive underachiever in the grand scheme of things. The teacher cleared her throat, gently addressing the classroom, stating that she really, truly hoped that they could hear from some of the other children in the room tomorrow. She then clapped her hands, announcing that it was officially clean-up time for the day. As the children began to gather the blocks, the teacher walked toward the back of the room, politely asking if she could speak to Beverly Rose's mother for a brief second. Becky stood up, a confident smile on her face. She preempted the conversation, stating that she already knew exactly what the teacher was going to say, bragging that Beverly Rose did indeed seem to be completely mopping the floor with the competition, though she assured the teacher that they did not view kindergarten as a ruthless contest. The teacher offered a polite, strained smile, agreeing that the little girl was clearly very bright, but carefully added that Beverly Rose was also incredibly vocal, perhaps even a bit too vocal for a collaborative classroom environment. She explained that this formative period was supposed to be a safe time for all the littles to not only learn the curriculum, but also to gain some necessary personal self-esteem. She pointed out that Beverly Rose was currently not giving any of the other children a single chance to participate or build confidence. Becky defended her daughter instantly, arguing that Beverly Rose only felt entirely free to talk because the teacher had successfully created such a wonderful, safe learning environment, telling the teacher that the girl's behavior was actually a glowing testament to her excellent teaching skills. Suddenly, Darlene stepped up beside them, mimicking a knocking sound with her fist and loudly asking who was there, answering her own joke by declaring it was the teacher of the year. The teacher sighed, her patience wearing thin. She informed Becky that due to the persistent over-participation, she had unfortunately been forced to move Beverly Rose's personal wooden clothes pin from the green success section of the behavioral chart down to the yellow warning section. She looked at Becky pointedly, stating that whether or not a child managed to turn their behavioral trajectory around was entirely dependent on the efforts of the parent at home. Becky looked at the chart, her confidence faltering slightly, but quickly recovered, assuring the teacher that she was looking at a dedicated parent who was absolutely fantastic at turning things around in life, adding a compliment about the teacher's knit separates as a parting shot. Later that afternoon, Becky and Beverly Rose walked into the house. Becky knelt down to her daughter's eye level, telling her how incredibly proud she was of her for having such a successful first day of school. Beverly Rose beamed, proudly stating that she had successfully answered every single question the teacher asked. Becky nodded slowly, shifting her tone to a more delicate, guiding frequency, explaining that the answering of questions was exactly what they needed to discuss. She told her daughter that even if she happened to know every single answer in the world, it might be nice to step back and give the other children a fair chance to speak. Beverly Rose frowned, explaining that it simply took far too long for the other kids to come up with an answer, and when they finally did speak, they almost always did it completely wrong. Becky offered a soft, sympathetic smile, explaining that it was perfectly okay for people to be wrong sometimes, noting that the other children could not necessarily help it if they were not quite as smart as Beverly Rose. Beverly Rose nodded earnestly, explaining that she had actually told the other children that exact same thing so they would not feel bad about their lower intelligence. Becky winced slightly at the revelation, explaining that if Beverly Rose did not let the other children answer questions, her wooden clothes pin was going to stay firmly stuck on the yellow warning section, and they certainly did not want that. She told her daughter that she was a green clothes pin daughter, and Becky was a green clothespin mommy. Beverly Rose nodded reluctantly, agreeing to try harder, while Becky stood up, muttering that she had to get back to managing the lunchbox, which was evidently the grand prize that a green clothespin life ultimately secured for an adult. Darlene walked into the room, overhearing the conversation. She smirked at her sister, joking that Becky possessed both physical assets and blonde hair, a combination that clearly killed her inside. She then curiously asked Becky if she had ever personally received a yellow clothespin during her own childhood. Becky scoffed, waving her hand dismissively, admitting that she had merely passed through the yellow warning zone at lightning speed on her permanent trajectory toward the dreaded, permanent red section of the behavioral chart. Darlene looked at her daughter, asking Beverly Rose if it deeply bothered her that she had received a yellow clothespin today. Beverly Rose shrugged, admitting that she supposed it did, but she emphasized that she simply liked knowing all the correct answers. Darlene kneeled down beside her niece, offering a completely different piece of advice, telling the girl that if she liked knowing the answers, she should keep right on answering. She added that if anyone ever told her to stop being smart, she should simply shout her answers even louder, stating that the entire educational clothespin system was nothing more than a giant psychological scam. She asked Beverly Rose if she felt like she had actually done anything morally wrong today, and Beverly Rose shook her head no, though she noted that when she offered too many correct answers, the teacher denied her the opportunity to visit the coveted classroom prize bucket. Darlene patted her shoulder, telling her that the ultimate prize in life was the internal knowledge that she absolutely rocked, while those other passive children were just natural-born losers. She then leaned in, whispering that speaking of absolute losers, she wondered if Beverly Rose wanted to sit in on a serious adult meeting with a bunch of really pathetic, conformist green clothespin people. Suddenly, a loud crackle echoed from Darlene's laptop on the counter, and she gasped, realizing with horror that her microphone was not actually muted for her corporate remote work meeting. Meanwhile, across town, Dan, Jackie, and Harris walked through the glass doors of the local legal cannabis dispensary. The interior was sleek, pristine, and brightly lit, looking more like a high-end boutique than an old-school drug den. Dan looked around the immaculate room, wide-eyed with utter amazement, remarking that the place looked like a surreal cross between Seth Rogen and Willy Wonka. Jackie looked around with a hint of nostalgic melancholy, admitting that she found the corporate nature of the modern establishment a little bit sad, wistfully recalling that there was a certain undeniable sweetness about buying illegal drugs from a shady character in a public park. A young, polished budtender behind the counter smiled professionally, asking the group how he could help them today. Harris stepped forward, holding up a hand to calm the employee, telling the worker to take it easy. She pointed to Dan, noting that while her grandfather might look like a decrepit, ancient old fool, he luckily had her along for the ride. Dan glared at his granddaughter but chose to address the employee instead, explaining that he simply needed something effective for his intense physical pain. Jackie interrupted, loudly stating that they needed something to cure the deep, existential pain of living in an entirely unjust world where the physical planet was burning up from climate change and citizens were actively losing their human rights to fascist rule. The budtender blinked in confusion, asking if they were looking for a remedy for global political anxiety, or perhaps just a hurt foot. Dan cleared his throat, confirming that they were definitely looking for the foot option, except the pain was located entirely in his right shoulder, mentioning that he used to smoke a little bit of grass back in his high school days to manage injuries. Jackie nodded eagerly, chiming in that they both used to partake back in the day, referring to themselves as a couple of old-school hopheads. She boasted to the young employee that they certainly did not get their regular grass from some giant, sterile corporate warehouse like the soft, modern generation, claiming that they had to bravely travel to the absolute other side of the train tracks just to purchase products from the street. She then admitted that she had recently tried a lot of alternative products infused with cannabidiol, but it simply did not seem to be helping Dawn's severe shoulder pain at all. The budtender assessed Dawn's large, sturdy frame, nodding thoughtfully and stating that since Dan was a pretty big guy, he could likely handle some incredibly strong, high-quality flour. He reached into the display case, pulling out a container and explaining that the specific strain was called Nightmare, noting that it was exceptionally high in tetrahydrocannabinol. He then pointed to a second option, explaining that it was popularly known as brain bleed, describing it as a potent strain that was strong enough to numb pain while still allowing the user to actively play a game of tennis. Dan shook his head, stating that he did not care about playing sports, emphasizing that he simply needed a product that would ensure he could not feel his shoulder whatsoever. The budtender smiled, pulling out a third jar, announcing that this specific option was called I Cannot Feel My Face, suggesting that it would probably work wonders on his shoulder as well. He then asked if Dan preferred to consume his cannabis in the form of edible gummies or traditional flower, and Harris jumped in, eagerly opting for the candy option. The budtender rung up the total on the digital register, announcing that the purchase would come to exactly $40. Jackie gasped, throwing her hands up in absolute shock at the price, loudly asking the worker where the rest of the inventory was stored, wondering if they kept a giant wooden barrel in the back where a customer could simply bag a couple of loose, cheap pieces of candy for a nickel. The budtender sighed patiently, informing her that this modern establishment was not a candy shop, and they were certainly not on Coney Island during the 1930s. Darlene walked up to the counter from the back of the store, having overheard the entire embarrassing exchange. She looked at the young employee, calling him Harry Pothead, and confidently stated that she had personally destroyed far more lucrative life opportunities with heavy drug use than the young man would ever hope to experience in his entire lifetime. Harris laughed loudly, pointing at her aunt, declaring that Darlene must be completely high out of her mind right now. Back at the house later that afternoon, Darlene stood in the kitchen as Becky and Beverly Rose walked through the door. Darlene looked down at her niece, gently instructing Beverly Rose to go directly downstairs to wash her hands, promising that she would prepare a nice snack for her in just a moment. Once the little girl had left the room, Darlene turned to her sister, her expression serious, stating that they desperately needed to talk. Becky sighed, adjusting her purse strap, stating that she was currently in the middle of her remote work day. She looked at her phone, agreeing with a colleague named and on a work message before pocketing the device and turning back to Darlene. Darlene crossed her arms, explaining that when she picked up Beverly Rose from school, the teacher had pulled her aside to report that the little girl was suddenly twice as aggressive as she had been the previous day. Becky defended her daughter immediately, asking if the teacher had specifically used the word aggressive or if she actually meant assertive, emphasizing that there was a massive, distinct difference between the two traits. Darlene explained that before the intervention, Beverly Rose was simply answering all the classroom questions. However, after Becky's lecture about the clothespins, the girl had shifted to actively calling out the other children in front of the room, loudly branding them as entirely dumb. Darlene added that when the teacher eventually threatened to move her clothespin to the permanent red section, Beverly Rose had defiantly looked the authority figure in the eye and stated that the entire system was a total scam. Becky smiled proudly, remarking that such a statement was incredibly perceptive for a 5-year-old child, arguing that Darlene should be proud of her niece. Darlene glared at her, revealing that Beverly Rose had explicitly admitted that Becky was the one who told her to act that way. She accused Becky of meddling, stating that the situation was absolutely none of her business, and she should have stayed out of it entirely. Becky fired back, arguing that Beverly Rose should absolutely never have to hide her natural inner light just to make others comfortable. She accused Darlene of playing stupid her entire life just so random people would like her. Darlene scoffed, clarifying that she did not play stupid, rather she practiced being highly strategic. She argued that angry, confrontational little ball busters who successfully alienate everybody around them do not get rewarded in the school system or the real world. She pointed out that the school had recently appointed Becky as a crossing guard, which was proof of her standing. Becky corrected her quickly, noting that she was assigned to the absolute most dangerous street, which happened to be located the farthest away from the actual school building. Darlene smirked, asking Becky if she had ever stopped to wonder why the administration had never actually given her one of those bright, reflective safety vests. Becky frowned, muttering that the school officials had explicitly told her that they had simply run out of the vests. She quickly redirected the conversation, asserting that asking Beverly Rose to refrain from answering questions was morally wrong. Darlene countered that it was not wrong at all. She argued that the girl desperately needed to learn how to successfully get along with regular people in the real world. Becky challenged her, asking if getting along actually just meant learning how to know her place as a submissive woman. She stated that she could not believe Darlene was refusing to defend her own flesh and blood. She reminded Darlene that while their deceased mother certainly had her share of personal problems, she would have absolutely marched down to that school and ripped the teacher's head clean off her shoulders to protect her kids. Darlene nodded, admitting that while their mother would have done exactly that, it resulted in the children becoming the weird kids with the visibly crazy mother. She asked Becky how she had genuinely liked experiencing that as a child. Becky softened slightly, looking down. She confessed that while she used to desperately want to crawl into a deep hole and hide while their mother was screaming at school officials, the extreme defense ultimately made her feel incredibly protected and more confident inside, which eventually made her a much stronger adult. She urged Darlene to think deeply about what specific kind of person she was ultimately teaching Beverly Rose to become. Darlene sighed, stating that Becky clearly wanted the girl to be less like Darlene and more like Becky, which Darlene viewed as the absolute last thing she wanted for her daughter. Becky looked offended, asking if Darlene truly believed it was better for the girl to turn out like her. She pointed out that Darlene had been so incredibly anxious to please people in her youth that she had completely given up her higher education and abandoned her family, just so she could move away with Mark to Minnesota. Darlene froze, her face darkening. She stated that since Becky clearly had nothing else constructive to say to her, she needed to get out of her face immediately. Becky turned to leave, tossing a final insult over her shoulder, suggesting that perhaps if Darlene were a bit easier to get along with in a professional setting, her company would not force her to work entirely from home. Darlene shouted back that the company did not force her, rather working from home was her own personal option. Later that evening, Dan sat heavily on the living room sofa, staring blankly ahead with a glazed, unblinking expression. Harris and Jackie walked into the room, stopping to observe his bizarre demeanor. Harris looked at him closely, asking what on earth was going on with him. Dan giggled softly, murmuring that nothing was wrong at all. Jackie stepped forward, scanning the empty candy wrappers on the coffee table. She demanded to know exactly how many cannabis gummies Dan had consumed. Dan blinked slowly, his voice slurred. He explained that he truly did not know. He recounted that he had initially taken a single gummy, but after waiting a while, it did not seem to work at all. Consequently, he decided to take a second gummy. Right after that, the very first gummy finally kicked in with full force. He explained that the sudden chemical reaction made him incredibly hungry, which led him to foolishly consume the third gummy. Harris widened her eyes in horror, stating that a person